Rising tensions at Gate 32. The airport buzzed with its usual symphony of rolling luggage, brisk footsteps, and the occasional static-filled announcements echoing through the terminals. Gate 32, however, was particularly crowded. Flight 192 was boarding, and passengers juggled coffee cups, smartphones, and overstuffed carry-ons as they waited for their zone to be called. Outside, the rain fell steadily, streaking the large windows with rivulets that distorted the view of the tarmac. Captain Jasmine Rivers adjusted her navy blue uniform, the captain's stripes on her shoulders glinting faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. Today was more than just another day for her. It was a milestone. After years of relentless work, late-night study sessions, and countless flights as a first officer, this was her first major commercial flight as the captain. Her heart beat a little faster as she reviewed the final flight plan with her co-pilot, Frank Davis, a veteran pilot with decades of experience. "You've got this," Frank said, his silver hair and reassuring tone exuding confidence. "Today's just another day in the sky. You're ready." Jasmine smiled at his encouragement. "Thanks, Frank. Let's make it a smooth one." Her voice was calm, but her mind raced with the weight of her responsibilities. Not far away, Karen Thompson stood near the boarding line, her expression already tinged with irritation. With a neatly styled blonde bob and an outfit that screamed affluence, Karen adjusted her pearl necklace as she glanced at her watch. She hated delays. For Karen, life was a series of inconveniences that other people were responsible for fixing. She sighed loudly as a gate agent explained a minor delay in the boarding process. Her eyes wandered until they landed on Jasmine, who was speaking calmly with another crew member. Karen's gaze lingered, her brow furrowing as she studied the young woman in uniform. The sight of Jasmine's captain's stripes seemed to trigger something deep in Karen, a mix of disbelief and disdain. "Is she the pilot?" Karen muttered, just loud enough for the gate agent to hear. Her tone was laced with skepticism, the kind designed to draw attention. The gate agent, a professional woman in her early 30s, offered a polite smile. "Yes, Mom. That's Captain Rivers, one of our best." Karen's eyebrows shot up. "One of your best? Are you sure about that?" Her voice carried the unmistakable edge of someone challenging authority. "I've flown with this airline for years, and I've never seen—" She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "Someone like her in charge." Jasmine overheard the exchange but remained composed. She had learned over the years to expect these moments. However, no amount of preparation could dull the sting entirely. She adjusted her cap, took a slow, calming breath, and approached the gate to continue her pre-flight checks. Karen, not satisfied with the gate agent's reassurances, leaned closer to the counter. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," she declared, crossing her arms tightly. The gate agent's professionalism never faltered. "Ma'am, I assure you that Captain Rivers is more than qualified. She has undergone extensive training." Karen scoffed, her voice rising. "How can you be so sure? This is my life we're talking about. I've seen too many stories about situations like this." Her words hung in the air, vague but pointed. Jasmine turned toward Karen, her posture tall and steady, her expression calm but firm. "Ma'am," Jasmine began, her tone professional but unwavering, "I understand your concerns. I want to assure you that your safety is my top priority. I wouldn't be in this position if I weren't fully qualified to command this flight." Karen stared at Jasmine, her lips pursed tightly. "I'm sorry, but I'm just not comfortable with this. I've never seen someone like you in this role before." The implication was clear, and it wasn't lost on the passengers beginning to gather around. Jasmine maintained eye contact, refusing to waver under Karen's judgment. "Ma'am, I respect your opinion, but this airline trusts me to command this flight, and I intend to do so with the utmost professionalism." Karen muttered something under her breath and turned away, storming toward the boarding bridge. Jasmine adjusted her uniform, took another steadying breath, and continued with her duties. Moments like these were all too common, but she had learned to let them fuel her determination rather than chip away at her confidence. Aboard Flight 192. As the passengers began settling into their seats, Karen found her place in first class, her irritation barely concealed. She placed her monogrammed handbag on the empty seat beside her, glaring at the crew as they moved efficiently through the aisles. She leaned toward a fellow passenger, a middle-aged businessman engrossed in his tablet. "Can you believe this?" Karen whispered conspiratorially. "They're letting just anyone fly planes these days. It's like they don't care about our safety." The man frowned slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sure the airline hires competent people," he replied curtly, returning his attention to his screen. Karen huffed dramatically. "I hope you're right," she muttered, glancing toward the cockpit. Her mistrust was palpable, her suspicion of Jasmine festering with every passing moment. In the cockpit, Jasmine and Frank continued their pre-flight preparations. Frank glanced at Jasmine, noting the tension in her usually calm demeanor. "You all right, Captain?" he asked gently. Jasmine gave a small smile. "Just the usual," she replied. "Some people still don't believe I belong here." Frank chuckled softly. "They don't realize they're in better hands than they could hope for. You're here because you've earned it, and you're damn good at what you do." His words were a balm for Jasmine's nerves. "Thanks, Frank. Let's focus on getting everyone to Atlanta safely." As the final boarding announcement echoed through the cabin, Jasmine adjusted her headset, preparing for takeoff. She knew this flight was more than just a professional milestone. It was a test of her resolve, one she was determined to pass. Karen, meanwhile, sat in her seat, her frustration simmering as the plane taxied to the runway. She tapped her nails against the armrest, her eyes darting around the cabin, seeking validation for her unease. When the flight attendant came by to ensure all passengers were seated, Karen seized the opportunity. "Excuse me," she said, her tone icy. "Can I speak to someone in charge of the crew? I have concerns about this flight." The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Ma'am, Captain Rivers is in charge of this flight. Is there a specific concern I can help address?" Karen leaned closer, her voice dropping, but still loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Yes, I'm not sure it's appropriate for her to be flying this plane. I'd like to speak to someone higher up." The flight attendant maintained her professionalism. "Ma'am, I assure you that Captain Rivers is highly experienced and fully capable. Please rest assured, your safety is in excellent hands." Karen crossed her arms. "We'll see about that," she muttered, glaring out the window as the plane prepared to take off. Little did Karen know, the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the turbulence her actions would cause during the flight. Turbulence on the ground. The gate area of Flight 192 buzzed with the usual chaos of an airport, a blend of rolling luggage, impatient sighs, and the occasional child's laughter cutting through the sterile brightness of fluorescent lights. Rain hammered against the terminal windows, forming rivulets that streamed down the glass, mirroring the gray mood of the stormy day. But the dreary weather wasn't the only tension in the air at Gate 32. Karen Thompson, a picture of meticulous grooming and entitlement, stood at the front of the check-in line, her neatly styled blonde bob framing a face set in perpetual displeasure. Every minor delay or inconvenience seemed personally crafted to offend her. With her monogrammed designer handbag perched on her arm and a pearl bracelet gleaming on her wrist, Karen had perfected the art of looking both aggrieved and superior. She tapped her heeled foot impatiently, glancing at the gate agent with a piercing gaze. "Why is boarding taking so long?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter of nearby passengers. "This is a first-class ticket. I didn't pay for this kind of incompetence." The gate agent, seasoned in dealing with difficult travelers, maintained a polite smile. "I understand your frustration, ma'am. We're just waiting for the final safety checks to clear. We'll begin boarding shortly." Karen huffed, adjusting the silk scarf draped around her neck. Her eyes wandered toward the boarding bridge, where a young woman in a crisp navy blue uniform stood talking to the flight crew. Jasmine Rivers, the captain of Flight 192, exuded an air of calm confidence as she reviewed the flight plan with her co-pilot, Frank Davis. The captain's stripes on her shoulders gleamed subtly under the harsh lights, a quiet testament to years of hard work and countless hours in the cockpit. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. Her gaze zeroed in on Jasmine's uniform, and more importantly, the captain's insignia. Is she the pilot? She muttered under her breath, but her tone was loud enough to catch the attention of the gate agent. Yes, ma'am, the agent replied with a smile. That's Captain Rivers. She's one of our best. Karen's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. One of your best, she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Are you sure about that? I've flown with this airline for years, and I've never seen. She hesitated, the words carefully selected but pointed. Someone like her in charge. The gate agent's smile faltered slightly. Ma'am, Captain Rivers is highly qualified. She's gone through extensive training and has an exemplary record. Karen crossed her arms, her disapproval radiating like a beacon. I'd like to speak to a supervisor, she declared. I'm not comfortable with this. Before the agent could respond, Jasmine approached the gate, her posture tall and composed. She had overheard enough of the exchange to piece together the situation. This wasn't the first time she'd faced skepticism about her abilities. It came with the territory. But today was different. Today was supposed to be a celebration of how far she'd come. Ma'am, Jasmine said, her tone professional and measured, I understand you have concerns. I want to assure you that your safety is my top priority. I wouldn't be in this position if I weren't fully qualified. Karen looked Jasmine up and down, her expression skeptical. I'm sorry, but I'm just not comfortable with this. I've never seen a female pilot before, let alone someone. She trailed off, her unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. I respect your opinion, ma'am, but the airline trusts me to command this flight, and I intend to do so with the utmost professionalism. Karen scoffed and turned away. We'll see about that, she muttered as she stormed toward the boarding bridge. Jasmine watched her go, taking a slow, steadying breath. The sting of Karen's words lingered, but Jasmine refused to let them derail her focus. She had worked too hard to let ignorance and prejudice cloud her first major flight as captain. Frank, her co-pilot, joined her as she finished the pre-flight checks. Everything okay out here? He asked, his tone laced with concern. Just the usual, Jasmine replied, forcing a small smile. Some people don't think I belong here. Frank chuckled softly. Let them think what they want. You're here because you've earned it. Don't let anyone take that from you. Jasmine nodded, his words a balm to her nerves. Let's get this bird in the air. In the air. As the plane taxied down the runway, Karen sat stiffly in her first-class seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit door, as if she expected it to burst open at any moment. The rain continued to streak the windows, creating a muted blur of the world outside. Karen leaned toward the businessman seated next to her, a quiet man engrossed in his tablet. Can you believe this? She whispered, her tone conspiratorial. They're letting just anyone fly planes these days. It's reckless. The man looked up briefly, his brow furrowing. I'm sure the airline knows what they're doing, he said, clearly uninterested in engaging further. Karen huffed and turned away, muttering under her breath. Her agitation only grew as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for takeoff. She was determined to watch for any signs of incompetence, convinced she would find evidence to support her unease. As the plane ascended, the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and confident. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivers. We've reached our cruising altitude and are expecting a smooth flight to Atlanta. Thank you for choosing to fly with us. The announcement was routine, but for Karen, it was a reminder of the woman in charge. Her skepticism deepened with every word. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her mind racing with imagined scenarios of disaster. Tension in the cabin. The passengers around Karen began to notice her behavior. A young mother seated across the aisle with her toddler glanced over, her expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Karen caught her gaze and leaned in slightly. "Doesn't this bother you?" Karen whispered. "A pilot with no experience, trying to prove something. It's like they're gambling with our lives." The mother frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I trust the airline to hire competent pilots," she said simply, adjusting her child's seatbelt. Karen pursed her lips. "I hope you're right," she said, leaning back with a dramatic sigh. Her muttering continued, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. As the flight progressed, Karen's paranoia only grew. Every slight bump of turbulence felt like confirmation of her worst fears. She flagged down a passing flight attendant, her tone sharp. "I need to speak with the captain," she said. The attendant blinked, taken aback. "Ma'am, passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit during the flight." Karen's voice rose. "This is a matter of safety. I need to know that she's capable of handling this plane." The flight attendant remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, I assure you that Captain Rivers is highly qualified. Please remain seated." Karen's outburst drew the attention of other passengers. The young mother across the aisle finally spoke up, her tone firm. "You've made your feelings pretty clear. Maybe it's time to sit down and let the professionals do their job." Karen turned to her, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me. I'm looking out for all of us. If you want to gamble with your life, that's your choice." The tension in the cabin was palpable as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The flight attendant moved to defuse the situation, but the damage was done. Karen had drawn a line in the sand, isolating herself further from those around her. Unbeknownst to the passengers, turbulence loomed ahead, not just in the stormy skies but in the cabin, where emotions were brewing to a breaking point. And for Captain Jasmine Rivers, the flight was about to test her resolve in ways she could never have anticipated. A brewing storm. The cabin of Flight 192 hummed with the low, steady rhythm of jet engines as the plane soared through thick layers of stormy clouds. Most passengers had settled into their seats, their routines varying from scrolling on devices to flipping through magazines or dozing off. But for Karen Thompson, settling in was not an option. Her indignation, sparked back at Gate 32, had only grown into a full-blown storm within her. Karen sat stiffly in her first-class seat, her meticulously manicured nails tapping a steady rhythm on the armrest. Every sound seemed louder, every movement around her exaggerated. She adjusted her pearl necklace for the third time, her gaze flitting toward the cockpit door. She couldn't believe it. A young, inexperienced woman at the helm of the flight. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the world, she told herself. Standards were slipping. Across the aisle, a young mother was trying to calm her toddler, whose giggles contrasted sharply with Karen's tense demeanor. The child waved a small plush airplane in the air, mimicking the soft roar of engines. Karen shot them a disapproving glance, her lips thinning as the toddler's enthusiasm grew louder. The mother noticed Karen's expression, but chose to ignore it. She turned her attention back to her child, whispering soothing words as she helped him buckle his seatbelt securely. Karen couldn't let it go. She leaned slightly toward the mother, lowering her voice. "Do you feel comfortable with her in charge? A captain who clearly isn't experienced." The mother glanced at Karen, her patience wearing thin. "I trust the airline to hire competent pilots," she replied, her tone clipped but polite. Karen scoffed. "Well, I hope you're right, because if something goes wrong, we're all putting our lives in her hands." Before the mother could respond, the plane hit a slight patch of turbulence, causing a soft ripple through the cabin. Passengers murmured quietly as the seatbelt sign dinged on, and the flight attendants moved to ensure everyone was secure. For most, it was a minor inconvenience. For Karen, it was an alarm bell. She pressed the call button, and within moments, a flight attendant approached, her professional smile unwavering. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Karen gestured dramatically toward the cockpit. I want to know what's happening up there. This turbulence, are we safe? Does she even know what she's doing? The flight attendant remained calm. Ma'am, Captain Rivers has already announced that we're navigating through a storm system. She's a highly trained and experienced pilot who's taking all the necessary precautions. Karen wasn't satisfied. Precautions? We're shaking all over the place. I've flown for decades, and this is some of the worst turbulence I've experienced. I don't think she's qualified. The attendant's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. Ma'am, turbulence is a normal part of flying, and the captain is doing everything to ensure your safety. I need to ask for your cooperation and trust. Karen waved her hand dismissively. Cooperation. Trust. This isn't about that. This is about ensuring that the airline hasn't made a reckless decision to satisfy some diversity quota. Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their glances darting between Karen and the flight attendant. The young mother across the aisle shook her head, her irritation evident. You've made your opinion very clear, the mother said, her voice cutting through the tension. Maybe it's time to sit back and let the crew do their jobs. Karen's head whipped around to glare at the woman. Excuse me. I'm just trying to make sure we're all safe. If you want to gamble with your child's life, that's your choice. The tension in the cabin thickened as other passengers began to tune in to the escalating confrontation. A man seated 2 rows ahead turned slightly, his brows furrowed in annoyance. Lady, can you just stop? He said, his voice firm but measured. You're making everyone uncomfortable. Karen's face flushed. Uncomfortable. I'm sorry if my concern for safety is inconvenient for you, but I have every right to question this situation. The flight attendant stepped forward, her tone taking on a firmer edge. Ma'am, I need you to remain calm and stay seated. Disruptions during a flight are taken very seriously. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the plane jolted again, a stronger bump of turbulence rattling the cabin. Gasps rippled through the passengers, and Karen gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. The cabin lights flickered briefly before stabilizing, and the hum of the engines continued, steady and reassuring. In the cockpit, Jasmine Rivers sat in the captain's seat, her hands steady on the controls. The radar showed a dense storm system ahead, the kind that required sharp instincts and quick decision-making. She glanced at her co-pilot, Frank Davis, whose calm demeanor was a steadying presence. Looks like we'll have to adjust our altitude again, Jasmine said, her voice calm but focused. The turbulence is stronger than expected. Frank nodded, his experienced hands moving across the controls. You've got this, Captain. We'll clear this patch in no time. Jasmine pressed the intercom button, her voice even and reassuring as it carried through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing some turbulence due to the storm system in our flight path. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We're monitoring the situation closely, and we'll do everything we can to ensure a smooth flight. Thank you for your cooperation. Frank glanced at her with a smile. Smooth under pressure. You're making this look easy. Jasmine allowed herself a small smile in return. Thanks, Frank. It's just a storm. We've trained for this. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the memory of Karen's words at the gate. She had faced prejudice before, but today's confrontation felt personal. She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt in the cockpit. A brewing conflict. Back in the cabin, Karen's paranoia reached new heights. She twisted in her seat, her eyes darting around as if seeking allies. Did you hear that announcement? She said to the businessman beside her, who had been trying to ignore her since takeoff. She's clearly struggling up there. The man sighed, closing his tablet. Ma'am, she sounds perfectly in control to me. Maybe you should give her a chance. Karen shook her head vehemently. You don't understand. This isn't about giving someone a chance. This is about life and death, and I refuse to sit quietly while someone gambles with my safety. Another jolt of turbulence rocked the plane, prompting more gasps from the passengers. Karen's fears boiled over. She pressed the call button again, her finger jabbing at it repeatedly. The head flight attendant approached, her expression calm but firm. "Ma'am," she said, her tone authoritative, "I need to ask you to remain calm and follow instructions. The captain and crew are handling the situation." Karen's voice rose. "Handling it? We're being tossed around in the sky like a toy, and you're telling me to stay calm. I want answers. I want to speak to the captain. Now." The attendant's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not possible. The captain is focused on flying the plane. Please remain seated, or I will have to escalate this matter." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a mixture of frustration and disbelief at Karen's behavior. The young mother across the aisle turned toward her again, her voice sharp. "Enough already. The rest of us are trying to get to Atlanta in one piece, and you're making it harder for everyone." Karen's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, the plane dipped slightly as it adjusted altitude. A gasp escaped her lips, and she clutched the armrests tightly. Unbeknownst to Karen, the storm outside wasn't the only challenge Jasmine faced. In the cockpit, a new alert flashed on the control panel, signaling the potential for wind shear ahead. Jasmine's grip tightened on the controls, her focus razor sharp. "Looks like the storm's not done with us yet," Frank said, his voice steady. Jasmine nodded, her mind already working through the adjustments they would need to make. Let's show them what a good crew can do. But for Karen, every moment of turbulence felt like a vindication of her doubts, a storm within and without, brewing toward a climax neither she nor Jasmine could foresee. A storm within and without. The cabin of Flight 192 was heavy with tension as the aircraft plunged deeper into the storm system. Rain lashed against the windows in relentless sheets, and every tremor in the fuselage seemed magnified by the heightened emotions on board. The lights occasionally flickered, a reminder of the turbulence rattling not just the plane, but the fragile balance of calm among its passengers. Karen Thompson sat rigidly in her first-class seat, her frustration and fear bubbling into outright paranoia. Her earlier outbursts had already drawn sharp stares and murmurs of disapproval from those seated around her, but Karen seemed oblivious to the growing animosity. For her, every bump and jolt was proof that her concerns were valid. She gripped the armrests tightly as the plane gave another sudden shudder, her knuckles turning white. Across the aisle, the young mother who had been the target of Karen's earlier tirade whispered soothing words to her toddler, who was clutching a plush airplane. The boy's innocent laughter as he mimicked the sound of engines was a stark contrast to the fear etched on Karen's face. "How can you be so calm?" Karen snapped, her voice louder than intended. She turned toward the mother, her eyes wide and accusatory. "This isn't normal. We're being thrown around in a storm, and you're just sitting there like nothing's wrong." The mother turned slowly, her expression one of exhausted patience. "Because I trust the people in charge of this flight," she replied evenly. "And maybe you should too." Karen let out a derisive laugh. "Trust? In her? You haven't even seen her. How do you know she's qualified? Just because she has a uniform." The mother shook her head, clearly done with the conversation. "You're scaring yourself and everyone else. Maybe it's time to take a deep breath and stop assuming the worst." Karen huffed, turning her gaze back to the window. The rain distorted the view of the dark, churning clouds outside, but it was no comfort. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. In the cockpit. The cockpit was a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in the cabin. Captain Jasmine Rivers sat in the captain's seat, her hands steady on the controls as the radar painted a vivid picture of the storm ahead. Beside her, Frank Davis monitored the instruments, his years of experience keeping him calm despite the challenges. "We're heading into the thick of it," Frank said, glancing at the radar. "This system is bigger than they predicted." Jasmine nodded, her focus razor sharp. "We'll have to ride it out for a bit before we can adjust altitude again. Let's keep the passengers informed." She pressed the intercom button, her voice calm and reassuring as it carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivers. We are currently navigating through a storm system, and you may feel some turbulence for the next several minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and rest assured that we are monitoring the situation closely. Thank you for your cooperation." Her announcement ended, and she glanced at Frank, who offered her a small smile. "You're handling this like a pro, Captain. You'd think you've been doing this for decades." Jasmine allowed herself a brief smile in return. "Thanks, Frank. Let's just make sure we keep it that way." But as they continued to adjust the plane's course through the storm, a new alert flashed on the control panel. Frank leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "We've got wind shear ahead. Looks like it's coming fast." Jasmine's hands tightened slightly on the controls. "We'll adjust speed and angle to stabilize. Keep an eye on the readings." The plane jolted again, more sharply this time, as the wind shear hit them. Jasmine's voice remained calm as she guided the plane through the shifting currents. The storm wasn't just a test of her skills. It was a battle against doubt, both her own and that of the passengers behind her. Karen's breaking point. Back in the cabin, Karen's paranoia reached a fever pitch. The turbulence seemed worse to her than it truly was, amplified by her growing distrust of Jasmine. Her earlier muttering had turned into outright complaints, her voice cutting through the murmurs of passengers trying to stay calm. "I knew this would happen," Karen said, her tone a mix of fear and self-righteousness. She turned to the businessman seated next to her, who had been stoically ignoring her for most of the flight. "This is exactly why someone like her shouldn't be in charge. We're in the middle of a storm, and she doesn't have the experience to handle it." The businessman sighed heavily, closing his laptop with deliberate slowness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but polite, "the captain is doing her job. Maybe you should let her do it without the running commentary." Karen bristled. "You don't understand. This isn't about commentary. It's about our safety. I have every right to be concerned." The young mother across the aisle, who had been quietly listening, finally snapped. "No, you don't," she said sharply, her eyes blazing. "You don't have the right to make everyone else miserable because you can't control your own fear. We're all nervous. We're all in this storm. But you're the only one acting like this." Karen's face flushed red, but before she could retort, the plane gave another sharp jolt. Gasps rippled through the cabin, and the seatbelt sign dinged on again. Flight attendants moved quickly, checking seatbelts and reassuring passengers. One of them approached Karen, her demeanor calm but firm. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said, crouching slightly to meet Karen's eyes, "I need you to remain calm and stay seated. Your behavior is starting to disrupt the cabin, and we cannot allow that during a flight. The captain and crew are handling the situation." Karen stared at her, stunned. "Are you threatening me?" The attendant's expression didn't waver. "Not at all, ma'am. I'm asking for your cooperation. Please stay seated." Karen sank back into her seat, her muttering reduced to a low grumble. The tension in the cabin lingered, a palpable weight that seemed almost as heavy as the storm outside. The eye of the storm. The turbulence eased slightly as Jasmine adjusted the plane's altitude, finding a pocket of calmer air. She let out a quiet breath, her hand steady on the controls. "We're clear of the worst of it," she said to Frank, who nodded in approval. "You handled that like a seasoned pro," Frank said. "Seriously, Captain, you're setting the bar pretty high." Jasmine gave a small, tired smile. "Let's just make sure we keep it smooth the rest of the way." But even as the storm abated, Jasmine couldn't shake the lingering weight of Karen's earlier remarks. They weren't new to her, but today they felt sharper, more personal. She pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the task at hand. This flight wasn't just about proving her skills. It was about earning the trust of everyone on board, even those who doubted her. And as the storm continued to churn in the distance, Jasmine knew that the real challenge wasn't just the weather outside. It was the storm of prejudice and fear brewing in the hearts of some of her passengers, a storm she was determined to weather with grace. Command in chaos. The cabin of Flight 192 was quieter now, but the tension was palpable. After enduring bouts of turbulence, most passengers had resigned themselves to gripping their armrests and praying for smooth skies ahead. The hum of the engines remained steady, a reassuring backdrop to the occasional flicker of cabin lights as the storm continued to batter the plane. Yet for Karen Thompson, the momentary calm was anything but reassuring. Karen's fingers tapped an anxious rhythm on the armrest of her first-class seat. Her earlier outbursts had alienated nearly everyone around her, but she was beyond caring. In her mind, she was the only one brave enough to call out what she believed was an obvious mistake, placing Captain Jasmine Rivers in charge of their flight. The businessman seated next to her had long since given up trying to reason with her, burying himself in his tablet. Across the aisle, the young mother with the toddler kept her distance, focusing instead on calming her son, who had grown fussy during the turbulence. Even the flight attendants now approached Karen with caution, their polite professionalism masking their frustration. Karen's gaze kept darting toward the cockpit door, as though staring at it long enough would expose some sign of incompetence on Jasmine's part. Every bump of turbulence reignited her paranoia, her internal monologue growing louder with every jolt. "This is insanity," she muttered to herself, her voice just loud enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. "We're all just sitting here, trusting someone, whoa." Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp jolt, the plane dipping suddenly before stabilizing. Gasps rippled through the cabin, and Karen clutched the armrests, her breath quickening. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and steady despite the chaos outside. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivers. We've encountered some stronger turbulence than expected, but we are monitoring the situation closely. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and thank you for your cooperation." The announcement was met with murmurs of relief from the passengers, but Karen's unease only deepened. She pressed the call button again, her finger jabbing at it repeatedly. Within moments, the head flight attendant approached, her expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, how can I assist you?" she asked, her tone betraying a hint of exasperation. Karen didn't waste time. "I need to speak with the captain. Now," she demanded. The attendant's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ma'am, the captain is focused on flying the plane. She cannot leave the cockpit during a flight." Karen leaned forward, her voice rising. "This is unacceptable. We're in the middle of a storm, and I have a right to know that she's capable of handling this." Several passengers turned to watch the confrontation unfold, their faces a mixture of curiosity and irritation. The young mother across the aisle finally spoke up, her patience snapping. "You've been complaining since we left the gate," she said sharply. "The rest of us are trying to stay calm, but you're making it impossible. Maybe it's time to sit down and let the crew do their jobs." Karen glared at her, her cheeks flushing. "Excuse me. I'm looking out for everyone's safety. If you're fine trusting your child's life to someone unqualified, that's on you." The mother opened her mouth to retort, but the flight attendant stepped in. "Ma'am," she said, her voice firmer now, "I need you to remain calm and seated. Any further disruptions will be escalated, and I must remind you that interfering with the flight crew is a serious offense." Karen's face turned red, but she sank back into her seat, muttering under her breath. The flight attendant gave her a pointed look before walking away, leaving the cabin in a strained silence. In the cockpit. Inside the cockpit, Jasmine Rivers was fully in control, her hands steady on the controls as the storm raged around them. The radar showed another patch of severe turbulence ahead, but Jasmine's voice remained calm as she coordinated with her co-pilot, Frank Davis. "We've got a rough stretch coming up," Jasmine said, her eyes scanning the instruments. "Let's adjust altitude and slow our speed. I want to minimize the impact for the passengers." Frank nodded, his experienced hands moving across the controls. "Good call, Captain. The winds are shifting fast, but we can ride it out." Jasmine pressed the intercom button again, her voice carrying a steady reassurance. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivers. We're encountering another area of turbulence, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The crew and I are working to ensure a safe and smooth journey. Thank you for your patience." She released the button and turned to Frank, who gave her a small nod of approval. "You're handling this like a seasoned pro," he said. Jasmine allowed herself a brief smile. "Thanks, Frank. It's just another day in the sky." But deep down, Jasmine knew that today wasn't just another day. It was a test, not only of her skills but of her resilience in the face of doubt and prejudice. She could feel the weight of Karen's earlier remarks lingering in the back of her mind, but she pushed them aside. This flight wasn't about proving anything to one person. It was about safely guiding the entire plane through the storm. A tipping point. Back in the cabin, the turbulence intensified. The plane dipped and shook as it adjusted to the shifting air currents, drawing gasps and murmurs from the passengers. For Karen, it was the final straw. "I knew this was going to happen," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. "This is what happens when you put someone unqualified in charge." The businessman next to her groaned audibly, turning to face her for the first time. "Lady, you need to stop," he said, his tone sharp. "You're scaring everyone and making this flight worse for all of us." Karen glared at him, her indignation flaring. "I'm not the problem. That pilot is the problem. We're bouncing around like a carnival ride, and you all want to act like this is normal." The young mother across the aisle chimed in again, her voice firm. "It is normal. This is turbulence, not incompetence. You don't know what you're talking about." The tension in the cabin reached a breaking point as more passengers began to murmur their frustration. One man seated a few rows back stood up briefly, catching the attention of the flight attendants. "Can we get some peace up here?" he called out. "Some of us are trying to stay calm, and she's not helping." Karen's face flushed as she realized the cabin had turned against her. For the first time, she faltered, her indignation giving way to a flicker of uncertainty. She sat back in her seat, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for a retort that wouldn't come. The calm after the storm. The turbulence began to ease as Jasmine adjusted the plane's altitude, finding a pocket of smoother air. In the cockpit, she let out a quiet breath of relief, her hands steady on the controls. "We're through the worst of it," Frank said, his tone light. "Nice work, Captain." "Thanks, Frank," Jasmine replied. "Let's keep it smooth the rest of the way." As the plane steadied, the passengers began to relax, the tension in the cabin slowly dissipating. Even Karen, now subdued by the collective frustration of her fellow passengers, remained quiet, her earlier bravado replaced with a sullen silence. Unbeknownst to her, the captain she had doubted so fiercely had just navigated them through one of the most challenging storms of the season, a feat that required not only skill, but a level of calm under pressure that few could achieve. And as the skies ahead cleared, the true depth of Jasmine's capabilities shone through, a quiet triumph that needed no validation from those who doubted her. Triumph in the skies. The cabin of Flight 192 had grown eerily quiet. The storm outside was finally receding, the turbulence now little more than an occasional bump. The dim glow of the cabin lights reflected the tension that still lingered in the air. For most passengers, the worst was behind them. But for Captain Jasmine Rivers, the battle wasn't just against the storm. It was against the doubts, both from others and within herself, that had loomed since takeoff. In her first-class seat, Karen Thompson sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of indignation and unease. She was unusually quiet, a stark contrast to her earlier tirades. The disapproval of her fellow passengers had silenced her for now, but inside, her frustration simmered. Each announcement from Jasmine, calm, measured, professional, felt like a reminder of her own powerlessness. Across the aisle, the young mother who had stood up to Karen was now focused on her toddler, who had fallen asleep clutching his plush airplane. The businessman seated next to Karen had resumed working on his tablet, occasionally glancing at her with barely concealed annoyance. Even the flight attendants had shifted their attention elsewhere, relieved that the source of the cabin's unrest was temporarily subdued. Karen stared out the window at the clearing skies. The storm clouds had begun to break apart, revealing patches of sunlight that danced across the plane's wing. But for Karen, the view was no comfort. She still felt trapped by the plane, by the situation, and most of all, by her inability to control what was happening. In the cockpit, Jasmine Rivers finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. The radar showed clear skies ahead, and the plane had settled into a smooth glide. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as she adjusted the controls, her movements precise and deliberate. Frank Davis, her co-pilot, glanced at her with a grin. "Well, Captain, if anyone doubted you before, they sure don't now. That was some damn fine flying." Jasmine smiled, though her focus remained on the instruments. "Thanks, Frank. It wasn't just me. We're a team." Frank chuckled. "You can be humble all you want, but I've been in this cockpit long enough to know when someone's got the right stuff. You handled that storm like a veteran." Jasmine's grip on the controls tightened slightly. "It's not about proving myself to them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's about doing the job and getting everyone to their destination safely." Frank nodded. "And you've done just that. But if it makes you feel any better, you've got one hell of a story to tell after this." Jasmine allowed herself a small laugh, the tension finally giving way to a sense of accomplishment. She pressed the intercom button, her voice carrying through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've cleared the storm system and are now cruising at a smooth altitude. We're on track for an on-time arrival in Atlanta. On behalf of myself and the crew, thank you for your patience and cooperation during the turbulence. We'll continue to monitor conditions, but for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the remainder of the flight." Her words were met with scattered applause from the cabin, a gesture that brought a genuine smile to her face. For Jasmine, it wasn't about the applause. It was about the trust she had earned, even from those who had doubted her. Karen's reckoning. The applause snapped Karen out of her thoughts. She glanced around, noticing the relieved smiles on the faces of her fellow passengers. Even the young mother across the aisle clapped lightly, her expression one of quiet vindication. Karen's hands clenched into fists. She couldn't understand it. How could everyone be so easily swayed? How could they trust someone who, in Karen's mind, had no business being in that cockpit? Her thoughts were interrupted by the flight attendant, who stopped by her seat with a polite but firm expression. "Ma'am, can I get you anything?" The attendant asked, her tone neutral but with an undertone of challenge. Karen shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "No, thank you," she muttered, her voice lacking its usual edge. The attendant lingered for a moment, her eyes searching Karen's face for any sign of acknowledgement or remorse. When none came, she moved on, leaving Karen to stew in her own thoughts. For the first time during the flight, Karen felt unsure of herself. The murmurs of approval around her, the captain's confident announcements, the clear skies outside, all of it contradicted the narrative she had constructed in her mind. And yet, admitting she was wrong felt impossible. Landing in triumph. As the plane began its descent, Jasmine's focus remained unwavering. The skyline of Atlanta came into view, the sprawling city bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight. She guided the aircraft with steady hands, her voice calm, as she coordinated with air traffic control. Frank glanced at her with a grin. "Almost there, Captain. Home stretch." Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the runway ahead. "Let's make it a smooth landing." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, the kind that only experienced pilots could achieve. A round of applause erupted from the cabin as the passengers let out a collective sigh of relief. For Jasmine, it was the sound of a job well done, a testament to her skill and determination. As the plane taxied to the gate, Jasmine leaned back in her seat, the weight of the flight finally lifting. She glanced at Frank, who gave her a thumbs up. "Welcome to Atlanta, Captain Rivers." A final confrontation. In the cabin, Karen sat frozen in her seat as the applause died down. She couldn't bring herself to join in. The smooth landing had silenced any lingering doubts in the minds of the other passengers, but Karen's pride kept her from admitting she had been wrong. As the passengers began to gather their belongings, the young mother across the aisle leaned over, her voice low but firm. "You might not like it, but she got us here safely. Maybe it's time to stop underestimating people just because they don't fit your expectations." Karen opened her mouth to respond but found herself at a loss for words. The mother's calm, pointed statement struck a nerve she hadn't expected. By the time Karen reached the gate, the other passengers had already dispersed, their focus on their next destinations. But Karen lingered, her eyes briefly catching Jasmine's as the captain stood near the cockpit door, thanking passengers as they disembarked. Jasmine's expression was calm, professional, and unreadable. Karen hesitated, the words of an apology forming in her mind, but never reaching her lips. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quick and uneven. The aftermath. For Jasmine, the flight was a success, but it was also a reminder of the challenges she still faced. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, and there would always be passengers like Karen. But today had proven that skill, professionalism, and resilience could shine through even the darkest storms. As Jasmine exited the plane, her steps steady and purposeful, she felt a surge of pride. This flight wasn't just a milestone in her career, it was a victory against doubt, both from others and within herself. And as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the Atlanta tarmac in hues of orange and gold, Jasmine knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.